Hello again, and we're ready now for the Chapter 11, Lecture 1. So, Chapter 11, it's called Personality. Well, what it really means, let me turn a light on here, is that we're talking about personality theory, which really means we're going to be talking about a handful of the schools of psychology that we've already discussed. So, what is the definition of personality? An individual's personality is that conglomeration or that grouping of personality traits or character traits that an individual has that come together in a very unique fashion that therefore makes each individual an individual. So what's a personality or character trait? That is an abiding, persevering, long-standing behavioral pattern that an individual continues to have over the course of time, even in many different situations. So, for example, if someone is just an amiable, pleasant person, that means they're probably going to be an amiable, pleasant person in whatever situation they're in, even if they try to not show that part of themselves. Eventually, it will come out. The same goes for a grumpy, irascible person. That individual is probably going to be grumpy and irascible in multiple situations. That's just one character trait. There are many. And your book identifies a handful of character traits in their model. It's not a bad model, but it's really not the model that psychologists use in psychological evaluations. In psychological evaluations, we look more at things like how suspicious a person is or how trusting a person is, how clear-minded they are versus cognitive confusion or many other traits. But those are the kinds of things that we look for in a psychological evaluation. But the model in your book isn't a bad one. But those are personality traits. Now, there are two major types of testing in psychology that you need to be aware of. There are mental ability tests and there are personality tests. Mental ability tests, these are intelligence tests, achievement tests, and aptitude tests. Now, you don't have to know this for this chapter, but you will have to know them come Chapter 8. An intelligence test measures intelligence, and we'll talk much more about that. An achievement test measures at what level of academic functioning a person has reached. In other words, what grade or what age level a person might be at in academic functioning, reading, writing, arithmetic. And then aptitude tests measure very specific abilities. We do a lot of these mental ability tests to measure learning struggles, such as attention deficit disorder or learning disabilities that people might have that make it more difficult for them to learn in a customary academic setting. So those are mental ability tests. So we'll put them aside, and now we'll talk about personality tests. Now again, personality tests are intended to measure the significant characteristics of an individual's personality, such as some of those things I've mentioned a little earlier. There are two major types of personality tests. These are objective tests and projective tests. An objective test is a test that is characterized by two specific criteria. Number one, an objective test has a limited number of responses to any given item on the test. So, That would mean a true-false test, a multiple choice test, or even a Likert scale test where you score between 0 and 5. Those are limited responses and therefore part of an objective testing process. The other part of objective testing is that we are able to create a large normative fund of data so that how individuals respond to a specific item might be very normal, or if people respond to it in a different way, it might be very abnormal. These kinds of tests, if any of you have been to the Career Center at Clark, they give the Myers-Briggs. That's a personality test. It's not a bad one. It's a relatively small one. Okay, so again, an objective test, the best example of an objective test is the MMPI, the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, a 567 true-false item test. I'm not going to show you a copy of this simply because it's just 567 questions, and with an answer sheet that you score true and false to. But it has a lot of very interesting questions. Some of them seem quite innocuous, like the first question on the test is, I like to read mechanics magazines. Well, I'll bet every one of you knew that fast, whether or not you like to read mechanics magazines. Excuse me. That's not a very controversial question. Another question that might seem a little bit more controversial might be something like, I often feel I am being followed by someone. Again, these are measuring very, very different issues. And there are numerous scales that usually have anywhere from 55 to 85 items off of the test on those scales. And those scales are used to determine how people score in comparison to that overall bell-shaped curve. It's a good test. It's one of the best personality tests. Has very good reliability, meaning you can trust the score that you get on the test. The other grouping of tests is our projective tests. Now, you can define it by identifying the opposite concepts of an objective test, and that is that these tests have a multitude of possible responses to any given item on the test. Secondly, it's very hard when you have a multitude of possible responses, actually an infinite number of possible responses to any given item. If you look at them as an individual, you will see some things that maybe lots of other people will see, or maybe you see something that's very, very unique that isn't very commonly seen by other people. So let's take a look at two of the more well-known personality tests, or projective personality tests. First is the Rorschach ink blot test. And yes, it's those ink blots that everybody thinks they've seen on TV, but they really haven't. It's administered in a very simple way. Simply the card is put in front of someone and they're asked, what do you see? Well, here's the first card of the Rorschach ink blot test. What do you see? Well, a lot of people see a mask, or they see a wolf, or something along those lines. But I'm sure you can see a lot of other possible things in here. The Rorschach ink blot test. There's card number one. This one, well, I hope you see it's two monks playing patty cake. whatever you see or whatever you don't see. It's very individual. Here are some others. This is often interpreted as two people dancing or two people cooking or whatever the case may be around a pot, things like that. Now this one only has one interpretation. This is Bigfoot riding a motorcycle. And if you don't see Bigfoot riding a motorcycle on this one, then you're just not getting it. Actually, this one is very specific to Clark College, because if you look closely, you can see penguins. Yes, do you see the penguin head right here and the other penguin head right here? Yes, there's just a myriad of things that can be seen in these cards. The individual who put together these cards had an idea that people with different types of disorders tend to respond differently to different items. And there's actually some evidence, some good evidence to support that. Additionally, these items well, they're very hard to score. If you have a single response item, I like to read mechanics magazines. It's a pretty simple item to score. But on the other hand, it can be quite difficult to score something like these very, very vague and abstract items that are shown in projective tests. There's another projective test. This is called the TAT, and yes, you'll need to know this. That's TAT stands for Thematic Apperception Test. Thematic Apperception Test. This test is a bit different from the MMPI, although it does have basic similarities. It's hard to score in a normative fashion, but it's also pretty impossible to not get an infinite number of possible responses to any given item. It's administered differently. In this test, there are cards that exhibit some type of picture or drawing, and the individual is asked to make up a story about the drawing. So, I'll show you a few of the cards on the TAT. Here's one. Look at it closely. Oops, there you go. It's a little boy, and he's sitting in front of a violin. How do you make up a story about that? Well, there's a myriad of possible stories that can be made up about this item. Okay. Let me show you a couple others. Here's one. What story do you make up about, oh, here we go, this young woman who's standing there by a field, pregnant woman standing over by the side, a man using the horse to plow, and this young woman is standing there with, oh, looks like school books in her hand. So you can imagine all the different possible stories that you can come up with this one. Okay. Here's another one that's kind of about an unhappy boy. This is an unhappy boy sitting in the doorway, or maybe not unhappy, maybe just pensive, who knows. It all depends. Most people think he's unhappy, that he's sad, waiting for his dad to get home, those kind of things. But nonetheless, you may have started to come up with a very different story than the one I suggested. This probably says something about a relationship to you. Now this one, what you doing in there, boy? Who knows all the possible permutations you could come up with that. Here's one that people actually like thinking about. What's this woman doing? Some people actually make up a story about her posing for a painting. Who knows? And then this one's pretty tough to not interpret in at least one way. She's got to be upset. But about what? And that's where the story goes off. Now, this test is called the thematic apperception test. Therefore, it's looking for themes that individual experiences and what that means for them. Themes in their life that become a part of their interpretation. So, those are some projective tests. So we try to measure personality as best we can. All right then. Now we're going to talk about personality theories. Today I'm going to talk about psychoanalysis. And then tomorrow I'll be talking about behaviorism, humanism, and biological theory. And along with behaviorism, we'll include some information about cognitive theory uniting with behavioral theory. And so I told you a very, very simple outline of psychoanalytic theory previously. I simply said it had three parts. One part is the theory behind the unconscious mind and the structure of the unconscious mind as Freud saw it. The second concept is Freud's theory of psychosexual development, stages of development in childhood and adolescence. And then finally, Freud's ideas behind defense mechanisms, those mechanisms that keep unconscious information in the unconscious mind. So, let's get started. We start with what Freud referred to as the three structures of the unconscious mind. Now, Freud discussed the id here and the superego here. These are two structures in our unconscious mind that are in the unconscious completely. This fluid line here is what he referred to as the limen of consciousness. Limen refers to level or line in German. The id and the superego are two exact opposite structures. The id is our pleasure principle. It is what we want, and we want it now, and we're a petulant, tantruming child. And we want what we want, and we want it now, and we're going to scream and yell until we get it. In essence, that's our id. It wants its needs and desires satisfied. The other structure is the superego, one word. Your book tries to suggest that the superego is your conscience. Well, that's a very bad definition, and it's not what Freud gave as his definition for the unconscious. Sometimes your textbook isn't right. The superego is more the extreme opposite of the id. It's not just a conscience, it's the part of us that can't ever enjoy life. It is always wrapped up in guilt, always wrapped up in responsibility. Now, what does that mean? That means if the id in a person's life goes unchecked, that person will become a psychopath. It also means that if the superego in an individual's life never goes unchecked or untaught, then it becomes a neurotic, an absolute anxiously ridden human being who takes responsibility for everything. Now, these two structures are so opposite of each other. They cannot even interact with each other. Therefore, they need a mediator. And that mediator is the ego. Now, as you can see, part of the ego is above this limen of consciousness, and part is below. So part of the ego is in the unconscious mind, part is above. I've actually misrepresented this a little bit. There should be less above than there is below. But the ego can communicate with each, the superego, pen's running out, with each, the id and the superego. Therefore, it can communicate with both and can help each to get some of its needs met, but not all of its needs met. Because getting all of the needs met of either the id or superego would be disastrous. Therefore, the ego needs to function as a mediator between the two. Now, it's doing it at an unconscious level. This portion of the ego that's in the conscious mind, this is consciousness above here. That's who we believe ourselves to be. That's who we think we are. Well, are we that? Well, apparently, according to Freud, we're a whole lot more, because there's a whole lot more going around down here in this primordial ooze underneath that alignment of consciousness. Now, what are they interacting over? Well, they're interacting over what Freud believed were the two basic motivators in our psyche. Let me write a couple things here. Freud actually believed that this was a life and death struggle going on inside of us, and that the two major motivators of human interaction are sex and aggression. Now, he used the word sex on purpose because he wanted to get people's attention during the Victorian era, and he did. He did a good job of that. The ancient Greek word for that is eros. Eros means love. And really what Freud was talking about was this continuum of affection that people have. The other is aggression, or thanatos, which means death in Greek. Meaning there's either anger or affection that people are struggling between. And aspects of the id and superego have aspects of both sex and aggression. So, a constant struggle going on in the unconscious mind. And this struggle produces a whole bunch of things that show themselves in real life. Now, Freud talked about, well, let me just talk a pinch more about this. You also see the names of Carl Jung and Alfred Adler in your book. Carl Jung and Alfred Adler were students of Freud. They both went in opposite directions from him. Jung took Freud's ideas and took them to an extreme. Alfred Adler took Freud's ideas and tried to commonsensical them a little more. Jung not only believed in an unconscious mind, he believed in 4 levels of the unconscious mind. And you probably will need to look those levels up. I think your book only talks about 1 or 2 of the levels. But there's the personal unconscious. That means an individual's experience. There's the familial unconscious, which is their generational experience and what comes to them from their multiple generations. There's the cultural unconscious, meaning that there are different iconic things in different cultures that mean very different things symbolically in our unconscious mind. And to understand an individual, we have to understand their culture. And then finally, there is the collective unconscious, which is the deepest level of the unconscious mind, where all of those very early evolutional aspects of us as human beings lie, that we all share together, that are engraved in our DNA, as it were. Most people think Carl Jung went a little too far, but he's had some pretty darn good ideas. I studied years ago for a couple of years with a Jungian psychoanalyst, and it's amazing what happens when you try to track an individual on all four levels of the unconscious mind at the same time. It's pretty amazing what you start to see that you wouldn't otherwise see. Alfred Adler, again, he tried to make things a little bit more commonsensical. He went off in the other direction. If you've ever heard of the terms, oh, darn. Superiority complex and inferiority complex. You've probably heard those terms used. Well, it was actually Adler who came up with them. Adler tried to desexualize the concept a bit. He tried to make the interpretation of dreams be a more commonsensical thing than Freud and Jung were suggesting, that every symbol in a dream had a very specific meaning, and etc. In psychoanalysis, one of the major methods that is used to access unconscious processes through dream interpretation. And so Adler looked at it very differently than did Freud and Jung. Now, the second basic concept of psychoanalysis are the stages of psychosexual development. And these are stages from birth to the end of adolescence. And whatever doesn't go well during that time has to be worked out for the rest of your adulthood. So let's talk about them a little bit. Stage 1. This is the oral stage. This is, and your book is wrong about the age range here. They say the first year. It's actually the first about year and a half, at least according to Freud. Why is it called the oral stage? Well, what does every infant do? They constantly grab everything and put it into their mouths. That is just what they do. It is constant. But what does an infant actually achieve from the oral stimulation? Well, what they achieve, for the most part, is comfort. First of all, they're fed that way. They're born with the instinct to suck, the instinct to root. When they're upset, it's not just about being hungry, it's about that sucking experience, that oral experience that gives them a sense of comfort. And that sense of comfort comes along with the concept of nurturance. So you've got the oral stage, about a year and a half, birth to about a year and a half, and then nurturance is the main thing that an infant is supposed to learn during that time. Very important to learn. If you've ever heard of the foundling home studies, foundling homes used to be orphanages for newborn infants. In the foundling home studies, it was kind of interesting that they found that children who were just held for a certain number of hours every day versus children who got the normal treatment, which was changing them, putting a bottle in their mouth and moving on to the next. The children who were held put on more weight. They moved more, and we know that movement, psychomotor activity in infancy correlates well with intelligence later on. And those children who were held cried more. Now you might say, well, that's a problem, but no. What that means is the children who weren't held learned very quickly it doesn't do them any good to cry. But the ones who were held, they cried because they needed that contact as an infant. How many cultures strap babies to the mother's body for that constant physical touch and comfort? It's extremely important. And that's all part of that oral stage, that physical touch. How easy is it to feed an infant without holding and cuddling it? even if it's not breastfeeding. It's very much all about that nurturance. So that's stage one. Stage two, this is the anal stage, from about 1.5 to 3 years old. And this is all about potty training. And you think potty training is not that big a deal, but oh my gosh, is it a big deal, both for parents and for the kids. And if you think about it, there's only one thing that it really means. What it means is control. This is the first time that little child has had control over anything in their life, specifically about themselves, but also more specifically, control of others around them too. It's very important to them. I remember one of my daughters, I have 6 kids, and one of my daughters would meet me at the garage door, coming into the house from the garage, every day during this crucial potty training time. And she would grab me by the hand and say, "Daddy, Daddy, Daddy, come see Daddy, Daddy." And we'd go to the downstairs bathroom and turn on the light and open and pull up the toilet seat. And there'd be a couple cute little turds floating around in there. And she'd be so excited and say, "Daddy, I poo-pooed the potty." We would have to clap for her and say, "Yay!" And then do the big flushing ritual and the whole bit. And kids, it is so important to them. This is just part of their existence. This means they've achieved. And also, if you think about it, it does give them a certain amount of control over the big people around them. If you're driving along and this little kid in training pants says, "I gotta go," do you say, "Oh, well, just wait about 10 minutes. We'll be at an exit in a little while"? Well, no. You roll over to the side of the highway and you pull the kid out and pull their pants down and let them go, because they're not going to hold it very long once they got to go. And you have to reward them for that activity. This is something important to them, because it is about them having control. And should little people have control over the big people in their lives? Some? Yeah, some. Not too much, not too little, but they should have an influence over the people in their lives. So that's the anal stage, and it's very important for them to learn that sense of self-control. If you notice, tantrums will often diminish significantly during that time that they begin to gain more and more self-control over their own bodily functions. The third stage is the phallic stage. This is from about 3 to 6, 3 to 7, right in there. And what is a phallus? Well, a phallus is a representation of a penis. And by the way, all you women want one. That's what Freud said. You all have penis envy. You all want one. Now, there's a little bit of truth to that. Every little girl wants to be able to pee standing up. But a lot of women laugh at that concept that they have penis envy. But the idea of the phallic stage is that children are learning gender identity. They're learning if they're a male or a female. And I know this goes contrary to many of the concepts today, but I'm certainly not arguing with any of those concepts. I'm just presenting what Freud said. Freud said that children during that age, they learn this gender identity, and they learn it through either the Oedipal or Electra conflict. Could turn into the Oedipal or Electra complex. But the story of Oedipus is a strange one, where a son who doesn't know it's his father kills his father. And this is an ancient Greek tragedy, and marries his mother to unite the kingdom. And then they find out what they've done. And the Oedipus digs his eyes out, and his mother poisons herself. It's a horrible story. But the concept is, little baby boys want their moms and little baby girls want their dads. And this is where people get into this idea that Freud was a pervert. Well, he did never say that children at this age want to have sexual contact with their parents. That's not what he said at all. He just said that opposite genders prefer the opposite gender parent at those times. And when they find that they don't get that opposite gender parent, then what they do to resolve that conflict is they associate with the same gender parent's gender role. Now, of course, this is a very stereotypic male-female gender role concept. But there's some evidence of this, and still evidence of what this looks like in our everyday life. Children learn this up to about 6-ish, maybe going into the 7th year. And then they go into their 4th stage. And this 4th stage is called latency. And this goes from about 7-ish to 11. Well, the word latent means hidden or dormant. Well, that means all sexual concept goes away. Think about it. Between the ages of about 3 and 5, do kids really care about nakedness and modesty? They don't care about it at all. And that's kind of fun. That's kind of nice. But they learn modesty. And then when they learn modesty, it's almost like these little kids are saying, I know there's more about this stuff. But, man, all this sexual stuff, I just don't know about it, so I'm just going to put it away instead. And they put it under wraps. Before that, a little kid will come up to you and say, hey, I got a rash. You want to see it? And now the kid, if they have a problem, they come up to you in a whisper. Hey, I got a problem. And they want to talk about it privately because they understand that there's some privacy about this whole issue. Well, this is also during the school years. This is where they're learning a lot of socially appropriate behaviors in a larger social setting. And again, this stuff is kind of just put away, and they don't talk about it. And then the 5th stage is the genital stage. And of course, genital refers to sexual identity. This is not the same as the gender identity of the phallic stage. This is sexual identity. This is a late childhood, early teen beginning to come to understand that we are sexual beings. And that as sexual beings, we have a purpose in our sexuality. And it's important to learn that sexuality. And often we have to be careful how quickly we present this, but especially during the latency period, we have to be careful. But when kids ask questions, kids need to have their questions answered. And it's an important way of helping them grow and develop their own sexual being. And healthy sexuality is a very important part of human behavior. Okay, well, those are Freud's 5 stages of psychosexual development. Oh, the age range of the genital stage is adolescence, 11, 12-ish, up through the end of adolescence. And what's learned here? Again, sexual identity. My experience has been, especially as a psychologist, that people come into my office feeling like their sexual identity began its development a little too early in their life. And they come with some distress about that and work it out later on in adulthood. So I suggest to people that they be wise and careful about their sexual identity and their sexual behavior. That, again, they be careful and wise about how they approach it, how they work their way through it. Okay. Now, the third basic concept of psychoanalysis is defense mechanisms. And what does that mean? Well, defense mechanisms mean there are structures in our unconscious mind that keeps certain information in our unconscious mind. It should be in our unconscious mind. It should stay there, at least until we're ready to deal with it. And that's what Freud talked about when he talked about different defense mechanisms. Now, you've heard of some of these before. Let me go through 3 or 4 of them. Freud identified 7 or 8 specific ones, and your book talks about them. The first one is repression. This is the one most people are familiar with. That when a person experiences a very traumatic incident, it's very possible that the psyche, that unconscious part of us, will take that information and put it away from a person's memory because the person isn't able to handle that trauma at that point in time. And they need other time to manage and handle that trauma. And I've seen that happen many a time in the psychotherapeutic process. People having a great deal of difficulty, almost feeling like there's something there but not knowing, but they really don't know. But then it reveals itself at some point, and when it does, it usually comes out in a very frightening and hurtful way. And we try to help them through that in the psychotherapeutic process. That's repression. And when we're talking about repression, we're talking about serious trauma. We're talking about combat. We're talking about severe abuse in childhood. We're talking about severe traumatic incidents, even in adulthood, that are put away into the unconscious mind for a time until the person's psyche is ready to be able to handle it. Projection. That's another one. Projection. Remember, these are all unconscious. It's not like we know they're going on in our mind right now, because we don't know they're going on in our mind. Projection is the idea that at an unconscious level we have a very unhealthy behavior or pattern or urge. So, for example, let's say at an unconscious level someone is very jealous. Well, they don't believe that consciously, even though people around them might believe that they have a problem with jealousy. But what they do is instead they see jealousy in everybody else around them. And then they throw their own jealousy or project their own jealousy onto other people. Projection. So even though that individual might only have just a sliver of jealousy, that person with that issue unconsciously sees that sliver and throws all of their jealousy onto that person and perceives them as this horribly jealous individual. When really they're probably not. Really, it's the issue of the person doing the projecting. Reaction formation. That's an interesting one. Reaction formation. This is when an individual has a very socially and interpersonally inappropriate feeling, desire, or urge at an unconscious level. Again, they don't know this, but they have this urge at an unconscious level. And at a conscious level, they go on a mission, on a purpose to go against that deep unconscious drive or desire. So this would be a young man who at a deep level, I actually knew this young man, really didn't like his mother. And he had good reason. His mother was a horrible mother. But at a conscious level, he would just shower her with praise and with affection. And it was a very disturbing, kind of absurd way that he went about doing this. But it was very clear that he had good reason to not think a great deal of her. It was uncomfortable to watch him do this. As I said, there are other defense mechanisms. and they all exhibit a tendency that we have deep inside ourselves that we're not consciously aware of, but that we seem to express in our behavior. And if the psychotherapist watches closely enough, can see those things coming out and therefore become more familiar with the unconscious mind of that individual. So, there is our introduction into personality, the definition of what personality is, what a personality or character trait is. We talked about what personality testing is, specifically objective and projective testing, gave you some examples of what those look like. And then we discussed psychoanalysis, mostly about Sigmund Freud, but also referring to Alfred Adler and Carl Jung, who were students of Freud. And finally, just understanding a little bit about what Freud's theory is really all about. Okay, well, I'll see you tomorrow with talking about the other three major personality theoretical areas, and we'll talk about a few different people in each of those areas. So, see you then.